So I'm going to make this really brief since we're we're jumping a little bit into the time here. E.G. Crichton is a dear friend of mine. We, many years ago, talked about the possibility of E.G. collaborating as the artist in residence of the GLBT Historical Society in San Francisco, and the first artist in residence, and still the artist in residence there. And it's an organization that's been near and dear to my heart for a very long time. And E.G. really took on digging into the archives, which is one of the largest and most extensive LGBTQ archives in the world, and finding really innovative and creative ways to translate what was there in the boxes and in the file folders into art and into community building and into new people seeing what was there in new ways, breathing new life into it. So I'm really excited to have E.G. here today. You have an introduction to her in your syllabus, but I do briefly want to say that as an artist, E.G. creates situations in which historical archives morph into multiple forms, migrate through social exchanges, and return to their temperature-controlled shelving intact. Her focus has been on individual lives, fleshed out through their artifacts and brought to life by passionate intention. And I'm so excited. She's shown around the world. She's an emeritus faculty at Santa Cruz, and I'm so excited to have E.G. Crichton with us here today.
So I graduated from San Francisco State, so anyway, it's nice to be on your campus. And I noticed some buildings that are named after wine. I thought, that's different. So I'm going to show you a project called Lineage Matchmaking in the Archive, which was my first project that I did with the GLBT Historical Society. And then I'm going to show you a project that actually introduces you to some of the other queer archives around the world. And it's amazing how many there are. So, and my presenter notes didn't work technically, so I actually have to use paper. How embarrassing. So I was trained as a visual artist, and pretty much as I developed, knew that I was really interested in interdisciplinary subject matter, and in particular history. And so a lot of my work started to involve research in archives. And I really became interested in the way that art can sort of bring out what's often boring, you know, historical archives that people use for research, into a bigger public and into a more visual and creative possibility. So that's kind of how I frame my work. So I'm gonna just show you a few artists that I encountered when I realized what I was doing, and also some of whom influenced me. And these are artists who also explore history in various ways and who research archives. Faz El-Sheikh is a New York-based artist who has done a lot of projects in the Middle East, including this one where he met people whose family people who'd survived the wars in Afghanistan, but who had lost family members, and he asked them to hold a photo of their family member. And so he took, you know, a lot of these photos, and it became a kind of archive of people who'd been lost in the war. Mary Kelly, also a US-based artist, did something in the early 70s that had never been done before in the art world, in the formal so-called art world, which is that she based a project on the first 3 years of her son's life. So she based a project on motherhood, and this was not a popular topic in the art world. Women weren't very popular in the art world, neither were people of color. So this was really kind of revolutionary at the time. And she documented everything from her son's first words to his poop to his movements, and presented, and it became this huge display that was a kind of archive of his life. I have no idea what happened to him or how much therapy he needed later, but Christian Boltanski is a French artist who, in 1971, proposed to about 25 museums in Europe that he display as an exhibit the artifacts of one ordinary man's life. And I think about 2 museums agreed to do it. And so, and he works as a fictional artist, so this is a fictional man, probably a fictional man's life. But, you know, he wasn't fabricating something, he was gathering objects and then using museum display methods to display it, which is what you see on the right. Song Dong is an artist from Beijing who, when his mother died, created this huge installation called Waste Not. And his mother was a hoarder, and so he gathered all the stuff that she had left and he organized it and turned it into kind of her archive, and he built that structure that mimicked the house that she lived in, which is the house he grew up in. I saw this installation and I realized that my mother was a hoarder too, but, and I think I've inherited some of that. Milagros de la Torre is a Peruvian artist who routinely researches historical archives. And one really interesting project she did called Under the Black Sun was based on the identity cards that any citizen of Peru needs to carry on them. And typically the photographic method for these identity cards is a process that makes people's skin look lighter. And so the kind of racist assumption is that people will be safer and do better in life if they have a picture that makes them look lighter skinned. So she kind of subverted this and used a different kind of photographic process and produced hundreds of these portraits in which people, in which they were negatives and also had chemical processing that brought out the reds. Suzanne Lacey is an LA artist who creates huge public participation projects. She was an influence on my work. I worked for her at one point. And she did this project in Medellin, Colombia, at a time when that city was really, really dangerous because of the drug cartels. And families were divided from each other, extended families. There were actually borders that people couldn't go across. But she collaborated with people there and realized that the thing that could cross those boundaries in the city was a bus. And so she created a museum in a bus. And the museum was made up of things that families donated, like pictures of relatives, and also letters that they wrote to people that they couldn't actually see in person. And so this bus traveled throughout the city, and people actually got on the bus and saw the museum. There's also a history of artists working as artists in residence, which is what I've done with the Historical Society. And one of the first that I knew of was Fred Wilson, who worked with the Maryland Historical Society. And again, instead of fabricating something the way we think of artists doing, he went into the museum's collection and he found stuff that the Historical Society in Maryland didn't even know they had. And he would present the objects in a way that brought out a certain history. So for example, metalwork, 1793 to 1880, showed these, silver chalices that an aristocratic family would own. And then in the middle, he placed a slave shackle. All of this from their collection. And similarly, he did cabinet making, 1820 to 1960, which had these chairs that were fabricated by woodworkers who were known. And then he included a whipping post that, of course, had an unknown date and nobody knew who made it. And finally, Merle Laderman Ukeles has been an artist in residence with the New York Sanitation Department since 1977. She doesn't get paid. This is her artwork, her volunteer work. And she started out shaking the hand of every garbage man in New York as sort of a way of addressing the fact that we often don't see garbage. I should say garbage people. We don't see them. They come at 4:30 in the morning or whatever. And garbage is kind of a topic that, especially when she started, was not something people thought about or saw. And so she made it visible in different ways that also became a kind of environmental activism. So now I'm bringing you to the GLBT Historical Society. Has anybody been there? A couple of you. This was the archive. It was in a different location from now where I first started looking at stuff. And the GLBT Historical Society has been around since 1985, so it's one of the oldest queer archives in the world. And two other artists who worked with the archive, I just wanted to briefly nod to them. Michelle T., who is a fiction writer, did a really wonderful project where she brought in various queer writers and asked them to pick a protest archive, an archive of queer that had stuff about queer protest, and then to write something that was a response. And this project turned into the Radar reading series, and it still exists today. People are still part of this writing effort. And then, Sean Dorsey, who is a transgender choreographer, has also used archives at the Historical Society as sort of a basis for both his Uncovered the Diary dance project and his Secret History of Love, where he based it on love letters found in the archive. This is the museum that's in the Castro that Don helped develop. It's separate from the archives, and this is where I've shown some of the projects I've done. So in 2008, I started wandering the aisles of the archives, trying to, I had maybe 20 abstract ideas, had no idea what I was going to settle on, but just started looking at stuff. And I opened boxes, went through folders, and realized pretty quickly that what I was most interested in was sort of archives that represented an individual person, and in particular a person who died. And sometimes it took a while to figure out if this person was alive or dead, because you actually don't have to be dead to have an archive there. So anyway, I discovered things like a love letter on a red napkin, a pair of sequin gloves, an unpublished sci-fi novel. These are not things that you typically think of being in an archive. I discovered this photo, which is dining hall number 3 in Topaz, Utah. And when I first discovered these things, I had no idea what they represented. These are a few of the boxes that first lured me to the archives. And it was a pretty easy seduction because I'm kind of a sucker for mystery. And I've always found the visual evidence of a person's life really, really fascinating. And I found out that I'm not alone, I developed this project called Matchmaking in the Archive, where I taught myself how to be a matchmaker, a new art skill, and started one by one matching individual people. I started with people I knew and then pretty quickly moved to people that I didn't know, and matched them to the archive of a dead person and asked them to get to know that person through their archive and to sort of form a relationship, and then to create a response in any medium that they wanted to do. An archive is interesting because it kind of distills a person's life into things like folders, files, boxes, and shelves. It's like a tangible biography. And each person's archive suggests a certain narrative, the narrative of your life, one that is sort of gathered and told and interpreted. So the work of lineage participants and the relationship between the archived person and the living person gives that archive a new life and a kind of body. Each box is filled with the possibility of touch, smell, sight, sounds, the metaphorical taste of one person's life. As matchmaker, I find that browsing the shelved collections is somewhat like cruising, threaded with the thrill of chance encounters and the lure of fantasy. To open a box, to pry apart its folders and touch personal artifacts, scrutinize photos and diary entries is really unsettling because of its voyeurism. An awareness of death is really part of each object that you touch in that archive. And what's not there makes you curious. There is a distinct feeling of overstepping a boundary. And one of my participants at one point said, "My experience was unsettling. I felt as if I had stepped into a stranger's house and gone through their drawers." I matched Luciano Chiesa, an experimental composer from Italy, with a box labeled "The Papers and Artifacts of Lawrence de Caesar, aka Larry Langtry," and he lived from 1931 to 1996. Larry was a really flamboyant, self-taught musician who made his living playing in piano bars from Alaska down to Mexico. He played a player piano, and in his box was an odd assortment of astrological charts, handwritten playlists, old photographs, sequin gloves, newspaper clippings, pieces of folded paper with important dates, and an ordained by mail membership card issued from the Church of God Within. Luciano interrupted his first archive visit when he discovered that Larry had performed at a bar called the Bucket of Blood Saloon in Virginia City, Nevada. How can you forget a saloon with that name? Luciano he came out of the archive in tears, and I said, "What's wrong?" And he said, he told me that not only had he been to the Bucket of Blood Saloon, but that this same bar had been the inspiration for an earlier composition, Quadri da una città fantasma, that he had composed. Luciano wondered, was this simply a coincidence? Was there an astrological connection between him and Larry? I just thought, damn, I'm a good matchmaker. After finding a card in Larry's box printed with the words "Prayer of an Aspiring Musician," Larry rushed home to compose an aria with the same title and decided that it should be sung by a male soprano named Don Tetro. In Luciano's words, "All of a sudden, I was rapturously moved by a few clumsy copyrighted devotional verses." Why, he wondered. Larry was hardly an amateur. Was this a lesson in humility? Should I turn off mine? After my photo session with Luciano, he wrote, "Larry was not my type, but I was historically intrigued. The only moment in the process in which something took place at a physical level was during the photo session. This is when I actually had to deal with the fact that Larry indeed had a body. As subjects, he and I had to measure our respective size and height to calibrate," what's that clicking? Am I doing it? To calibrate various poses, to make sure I was not covering his face or he mine. I was projecting images of the archived person onto the wall and posing the participant, living person, in that projection. For some poses, Larry was my age, and we made a nice couple, and others, Larry was an older gentleman with southern sideburns, and we played out a daddy aesthetic with me as the younger lover. For each matched pair, I created a portrait in which the living and the dead occupy the frame at the same time. Each photo shoot lasted about 2 hours or more, and my living models frequently spoke to their projected matches, as well as with me and whoever else was in the room. Laughter, discomfort, conversation, and technical distractions all mingled with a bit of the uncanny and felt like a form of community outside the boundaries of time. Troy Boyd, who was Luciano's partner at the time, I matched him to the archive of George Choi, who had been an AIDS activist and died in the 1990s. Troy said, my letter, he wrote a letter to George Choi. My letter is a thank you to George, a reflection on life as a gay African-American male in admiration of how George stepped out of the shadows and pushed for change. I found George's ACT UP promotion poster bold and extremely sexy. And as with each of these pieces, I, came up with some way to exhibit it in the exhibits that came out of this project. With Gabriella Ripley Phipps, who was one of my students at the time, I tried something new. There was no archive collection for Sally Binford, who, in the words of her friend Susie Bright, was an astonishing person, an anthropologist, anti-war activist, founding feminist, and early sex radical. I had already come to the conclusion that women, trans, and people of color take up far too little shelf space in the archives. So I put Gabriella in touch with Susie and with others, and she really immersed herself into Sally Binford's life. She spoke with her granddaughter, she attended her former poker party, and gathered photographs and documents to fill an archive box. So this became a new archive. For her project, she, in the art department where I taught at UC Santa Cruz, gathered 12 of her friends, all around her age, and asked them to bring 2 objects that if they were creating an archive, they would put in their archive, and to do it anonymously. And so the dinner party that she created involved actual food, but it also involved people trying to speculate on which objects belong to which person, and to sort of talk about what it would be like as a young person to come up with an archive of your life. And what you're seeing are, on the left are the clipboard forms that she had people fill out, and then on the right, some of the actual objects and a video that she took of this archival dinner party. Discovering the Helen Harder collection in the archives ignited my own fantasies as much as any 21st century figure might do. There she was in her World War II Air Force jacket, her parachute hanging jauntily from around her waist. Damn, she was handsome. Not usually turned on by a woman in uniform, I found that this one, safely ensconced in the past, reached out flirtatiously from the black and white snapshot. Maybe that's why I matched Helen with a gay man, filmmaker Bill DeMoncos, no competition. In another coincidence that bolstered my confidence as matchmaker, Bill told me his favorite film, called Wings, is about a Russian World War II woman pilot. So both women had become mothers, and both had a difficult time adjusting to life after the war. Bill created The Poppy, which was based on a poem that Helen Harder, who also went by the name Eleanor Sug, I think that was her birth name, he created a film, an experimental film that was sort of inspired by this poem. Using a combination of manipulated archive film footage, digital animation, and special effects, his film evokes an inner landscape of poetic juxtapositions. And he says, as someone attracted to the darker side of human nature, I was captivated by Helen's personal, uncompromised, poetic voice. Her poems were pretty depressing. Whoops, I'm going backwards. And these are stills from his film. He uses old archival footage and pieces it together to do his film, sort of like collage technique. And here Bill is with a picture of Helen Harder as when she was older. Alyssa Perry, I matched to Pat Parker. And part of the reason was that Alyssa had told me that when she was, I think about 13, and just starting to think about that maybe she was a lesbian, she read Pat Parker's poetry. And Pat Parker was sort of very well known in the lesbian world as a really incredible poet. And she died far too early from breast cancer. And so when Alyssa found out that you know, as she grew up and actually came out as a lesbian, she found out that Pat Parker had died and was really kind of heartbroken. So she created this piece that actually involved a bed in the gallery, and she recreated from memory the bed that she slept in at age 13 and wrote in her diary. And it included poetry books by Pat Parker. It also included some of Alyssa's diary entries, which she wrote directly onto the sheets. Nomi Lamb, a musician and singer. I matched to Sylvia Cohan, who was from Argentina and was also a singer-songwriter. And Nomi did kind of, this is Sylvia Cohan's box. Nomi did kind of an incredible thing, which was that she organized a jam session at the Historical Society in their big sort of meeting room, and brought all these people in, and she hung clothes that had belonged to Sylvia that you saw in that box. And she taught people Sylvia's songs. And so in this jam session, which we recorded, it was these people interpreting Sylvia's songs and bringing them to life again. And that became what was shown in the exhibit. Tina Takamoto, an artist, writer, and professor, was matched with Jiro Onuma, who immigrated from Japan to California at age 19. And then in the 40s, during World War II, he was carted off to a Japanese internment camp. This is Jiro Onuma's, some of his archive box. It included a lot of photos and various artifacts like passports, and these identity and naturalization papers, which are kind of revealing, you know, words from the 40s and 50s that were coded on these forms, like never married, and like that his skin color was sallow. These were coded terms for race and sexuality. This is a picture that Jiro probably took of 3 of his friends in the camp, and you can see the guard tower in the back. This is a postcard that's in his file with a little gold penis pin attached to it. And here again is dining hall number 3. And it turns out that Jiro worked in this dining hall when he was in the internment camp, and he's in the front row all the way to the right. And the identifying identity of the names of people were written on the back. For Tina's piece, which she called Gay Bachelor's Japanese American Internment Camp Survival Kit, she taught herself, she did a lot of research and taught herself the craft skills that were used in the camps and made objects from materials that might have been accessible. So she was making kind of a care package for Jiro. And examples of this were where she figured that tar paper would have been available. And so she made a wallet and a cigarette holder out of tar paper and painted photos, paintings based on photos in his archive on those. She learned taught herself how to carve and made these cufflinks. And she also made Japanese, what are called Japanese Hanafuda cards, which normally have flower pictures on them. She recreated them with pictures of muscle men, because it turns out that Jiro was quite obsessed with muscle building and a sort of muscle man culture of the 1940s. And so she also created this physical culture school medal and an exerciser that she imagined he might have had access to, and a chart to keep track of his exercises. In Tina's words, I grew up hearing family stories about internment camps, but no one ever mentioned the gay and lesbian experience of imprisonment. I tried to imagine how Jiro survived the isolation, boredom, humiliation, and heteronormativity as a dandyish gay bachelor who was obsessed with erotic male physical culture magazines. When I found out that Enuma enrolled in Earl Lederman's 12-week correspondence physical culture school program, I wondered, was he receiving letters from Lederman as a way to keep his queer imaginary alive? Other portraits that I made. And Tina writes, Looking for Jiro, which is a film I'm gonna show, a 5-minute film I'm gonna show you, is a queer meditation on the incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II. Jiro worked in the prison mess hall and liked muscular men. How did this dandy gay bachelor survive imprisonment? This queer musical mashup video features drag king performance, US propaganda footage, muscle building, and homemade bread making.
Time goes by so slowly. Time goes by so slowly. Time goes by so slowly. Time goes by so slowly.
So I know that we're kind of getting close on time, so I'm just going to show you images really fast. I'm just showing you a few examples of the work that was done. In all, there were about 24 people that participated in this project. And it got exhibited two times in San Francisco, and then it got presented all over the world, actually. So these are just to give you sort of a hint of some of the other people involved and their projects. Oh, and that's just a little animation I did to kind of show how people might interact, you know, with their projected archive match. The first time that this got exhibited was at the Historical Society gallery at that time. And it took a lot of work to set it up, and I had a lot of really generous volunteer help. And the idea of the exhibition was to recreate the archive outside the archive. So I used actual archival shelving as a display mechanism. And it was a very audio-visual, you know, there was a wide range of media in this show, and it was based on the work of the first 11 participants. I fabricated these transparent boxes to create archives where you could actually see what was inside. And I used quotes that people gave me about how they felt about their archive match. I made that into text that sort of snaked around the gallery. The second show was at the South of Market Cultural Center, and minus the archive shelves, and it involved the next 8 participants. And I, again, used the idea of people's words on the wall. And these are just a couple of views of the work. Is there any way to dim the lights a little? Because this is getting so washed out.
I can't figure out how to do it without it
Oh, okay. And there were people involved in this and events. And these are images from some of the events. The events included readings, Don Tetros singing that aria that you heard, Camille Norton reading a poem that she wrote in response to her archive match, etc. So I'm just going to give you a little bit of a tour of the project that grew out of this. And it grew out of this because I started taking the Lineage project elsewhere. For example, I presented it at a conference in Brisbane, Australia. And at that conference, I met somebody who really wanted to be matched. So we did this long distance match, and that turned into a project that unfolded in Portugal at another conference. And I started to think of this as archives that were in motion, that crossed borders, sometimes more easily than people can cross borders. And it also happened with things like a show in Quezon City, Philippines, called Nothing to Declare, that I was invited to participate in, and where a group show where I invited 8 people to give me the archive of somebody who died in a form that I could carry in a suitcase. And so I carried the suitcase to, it was on the campus of the University of Philippines, to their museum, and the guards checked it very carefully. And these are just, you know, some quick images of just some of what I showed there. And I wanted to bring something back. You know, I like this idea of me taking archives across the Pacific Ocean, and I wanted to bring something back. And I met these 2 women, Jenny Villar and Beth Angsioko, who ran a restaurant that was also a cultural center, and they were really, really interested in history. So we had a lot to talk about and a lot in common, and they donated these images, which were based on postcards that they found in a flea market. And nobody knows who this man is. They all portray this man named Lauro, who was writing basically love notes in English, Spanish, and Tagalog to somebody named Doming. And so this is what I brought back, and you'll see those a little bit later. In Amsterdam, at an queer archive conference, I got in touch with queer archives all over the world and asked them to send me images and text to actually select 2 archives that could become delegates to this conference. And I created a sort of ad hoc show. These are just some of the archives that I later polished to show in the museum in the Castro. So each of 11 archives that I narrowed it down to had a panel. I also interviewed archivists and had a sound and video component. And this is a close-up of 2 panels that I created based on 2 people in the GLBT Historical Society archives. So these are some of the organizations that I interacted with. You can see that they're really from all over, every continent except Latin America. I hope to add that at some point. And one iteration of this project was the result of an invitation to Bologna, Italy, where one of the participants in the Amsterdam conference invited me to bring migrating archives to there. And this is their queer center, which is donated to them by the city. This is a very progressive city. It's a medieval building that has a disco in the bottom basement. And half a block away is the Museum of Contemporary Art in Bologna. And so for the first time, they invited the Queer Center to have this exhibition at this art museum. And so I created a project called Archivi Migranti, excuse my bad Italian pronunciation, and did something new, which is that I communicated with each archive, and I said, I want to present. 106. Oops. It's difficult. I want to have you give a gift to the Bologna archive, and I'll fabricate the gift. So I collaborated with these archives, and we came up with ideas for what that gift, that metaphorical gift might be. So this is a person that the Australian archive picked, Monty Punchin. And I actually have a recording of her voice, which is what you were just listening to. And then they also picked somebody named Lynn, who, this is the archive's affectionate name for him. Nobody really knows his name. He was one of an anonymous group of Australian GIs stationed in Papua New Guinea during World War II. And at some point, the American contingent wrote the Australian and were very concerned because they said that American soldiers were having sexual relations with Australian soldiers, and that the Australian soldiers were playing the female role. So because of the Americans instituting this, they did a study, and in exchange for telling about their lives, these men actually got pardoned without criminal charges. 1 minute, okay. So I'm just gonna go through this really fast. I used voice actors to sort of bring out the voices of some of the people that people picked, all based on actual words from somebody's archive. This was the gift that I collaborated to create. It was, we imagined the locker of Lynn. This is the Hungarian lesbian organization named Lebriz, and they picked what we would call today a transgender character named Sandor, or born Sarolta Vey. I'm out of time, huh? Yeah, right. Okay, that's all right.